So in this video, we're going to talk about Sherry Shenoda's poetry collection, Mummy Eaters. So Shenoda is a Coptic Egyptian, which is really significant in terms of cultural identity, because the Copts are I think there's a few different sort of denominations of Coptic Christians, but they are predominantly Christians within a largely Muslim country, contemporary Egypt. And the Copts are specifically interesting because they are or see themselves as the sort of direct inheritors of ancient Egypt. And the reason that I say or see themselves as is because for me, these kinds of claims of cultural continuity or linking are always somewhat fraught, right? To the extent that, say, contemporary Greeks identify as the descendants of classical or Hellenistic Greeks, to the extent that modern day Italians see themselves as direct descendants of Romans. There's linguistic similarities. I mean, obviously Italian is a different language than Latin. Modern Greek is different from ancient Greek. Coptic Egyptian, which is its own language, is a descendant of ancient Egyptian. And I don't think we have a good sense of exactly how close the sounds are, but like Coptic Christians are 100% a different religion than ancient Egyptian polytheists, right? The same thing is true for Greeks and Italians. Greeks are mostly Greek Orthodox. Italians are mostly Catholic. Neither of these were the religions of those ancient civilizations, right? So there's this sort of fraught element of cultural inheritance. And part of the reason that that's important is because one of the things that Mummy Eaters explores is the difficulty of creating an identity that is rooted in the connection to the ancient past. And in particular, a connection that functions through the filters of colonialism, and not just sort of contemporary colonialism, but going back to the conquest of Egypt by Alexander, right? Alexander the Great. And then the Roman conquest, the Arab conquest, up to the modern period with European conquests, right? So you have those elements that create sort of barriers to an unbroken connection with the past. But you also have a very distinct fetishization of Egyptian culture, particularly in Europe. There were multiple rounds of what's called Egyptomania. One very prominent one being in the 1920s, after Howard Carter and Lord Carnarvon discovered King Tut's tomb, right? People in Britain especially, but people in Europe went crazy for Egyptian stuff. And so, but this sort of goes way, way back, right? Where people, like the antiquities trade, and particularly the excavation and sale or theft of mummified human and animal remains, right? And so that's actually where the title of this collection comes in, Mummy Eaters, right? Because during I think it started really in the 18th century, but during the 19th century, definitely, there was a belief among many Europeans that you could ingest in some form mummified human remains as a form of medicine. So people literally were consuming mummies. They were consuming these ancient corpses in a way that sort of parallels the consumption of Egypt as such within colonialist structures. And so on the sort of macro political level, that's the focus of Shenoda's collection. But there's also the more sort of micro level about that personal experience of struggling to connect with the past, both the ancient past, but also even the immediate past, right? The sort of difficulties of growing up in a different world than one's grandparents, for instance. So that's really what the collection is focused on. And we get that from the Invocation poem, which is the first one I'm going to read for you. It's called Sunflowers of Fukushima. And it deals with these themes, right, of history, violence, exile, and identity, all of which get sort of recurringly explored. So, this is Sunflowers of Fukushima, Invocation. Monk Koinabe gifts seeds in a land desolate with exile. These broad-faced sun-worshippers stand golden-crowned, 8 cubits high in peaceful armies, to sip toxic radiation from abused soil, hyperaccumulate poison, serve, and be uprooted. Would that I could plant in handfuls of seeds myself offered in peace. Plant me in the Ethiopian highlands before the Renaissance Dam, in Lower Nubia before the Aswan Dam, in the streets of Alexandria, between the mob and the body of Hypatia, between decay and loss of knowledge. Plant me on the steps of the Library of Alexandria. Plant me between every tongue that praise, O God, the great and eternal, and every tongue that praise, in the name of God, the most merciful. Plant me between the heights and the bank, between the golden gate, gate of mercy, and the gate of repentance. Plant me between the Golden Gate Bridge and the Empire State Building, broken heart land of my rebel country. Plant me until we bud forgiveness, the ground hollowed, and from lamentation our song swells, from dark earth an ascendant paradise. So this is, again, about these sort of connections and the ways in which they shape identity, right? Because Shenoda is Coptic Egyptian, but she currently lives, at least at time of the publication of this book, lived in the United States. I assume that she still does. I have no information to the contrary. But, right, so there's that element of individual exile, but there's also that element of sort of historical exile, right? That sort of feeling of being separated from these sort of symbols of ancient Egypt, right? The Library of Alexandria, which is kind of more of a Greek thing, but a Greek Egyptian thing. But the Nile especially, right? And the various damming projects along the Nile, all of which have really made significant cultural changes to Egypt. So, I mean, and some very much in the modern period, right? The Aswan Dam was in the 50s, I think. 50s or early 60s during the reign of Nasser. And, like, it largely stopped the flooding of the Nile that had been a foundation of Egyptian life and prosperity for thousands of years. And so the like physical barrier of the dam creates this psychological or cultural barrier dividing the speaker from that ancient heritage of the Nile and its centrality to Egyptian life and agricultural practice, etc., right? So this idea of planting oneself, and of course that comes with the metaphor of putting down roots, right? We often talk about this as a sort of conceptualization of home, that one has roots in a place. And so the idea of planting, right? And of course, it's linked to the Fukushima nuclear disaster of 2011, if I remember correctly. I may be wrong about that. But This, of course, introduces the idea of sort of catastrophe, of catastrophic loss and violence, and the way that history is periodically sort of wrenched by these major events and things like this, right? All of which disrupt identity. So those are really sort of the key thematics of the collection. And I want to read you a few more poems that sort of explore various elements of these. So this next one that I want to read you is really about the sort of themes of loss, death, the afterlife, and the sort of struggle to remain connected to what has been lost. This is called Aftermath, a mother's long wail. May the land of Ra steady may the hand of Ra steady the hand of the priest to preserve her beloved face to face, life beyond life. May she recognize herself, her soul in the field of reeds. May they sway on a mild breeze before her. What now must I do with this absence left behind, this life cratered in her shape? Absence of her has become a presence. Absence lies down, rises up. Absence sleeps soft-cheeked, curled in her bed. The room is still, expectant. I will give her clothes away, but not yet. Absence wears them, her soft linen. Absence outlines her eyes in dark malachite. Like my breasts that leaked milk in mute grief after the daughter born still, I leak now in mute grief, though the priests remind me she is alive there through the aperture of grief. I look up expecting her face in the doorway, but it is empty. Again and again it is empty, save for the absence. Absence unaccustomed to the light presses heavy on my chest at night, of a body that gave birth to a life ripped from me in pain twice. Right, so this idea of, and this is part of the sort of first portion of this collection, which is really rooted more in ancient Egypt. The latter portions of the collection become much more focused on contemporary Egypt or the contemporary Egyptian diaspora. But the first portion of the book is sort of telling stories of people in ancient Egypt. And we have developed here that idea of loss and the desire for preservation, right? So if we think at the beginning of this, may the hand of Ra steady the hand of the priest to preserve her beloved face-to-face life beyond life. One of the things that mummification was supposed to do is preserve the individual for the afterlife, right? And the Egyptians, as far as we can tell, didn't sort of conceptualize this in the way that, say, Christianity conceptualizes the afterlife, where it was like, there's this life which has a physical and a spiritual dimension, and then the next life is a spiritual dimension without the physical components. The Egyptians don't seem to have conceptualized it that way. And indeed, many ancient cultures didn't seem to have conceptualized it that way, right? That's why people were buried with grave goods, not just in Egypt, but in cultures across the world, right? People would be buried with food. They would be buried with, like warriors would be buried with their weapons. Crafts people might be buried with the tools of their craft. Farmers might be buried with farm tools, whatever it is, right? These things that, like, they were physically sent to the afterlife. It's possible that these are offerings to the gods, right? But it's also, but I think the general consensus seems to be that these are things that are meant to help that person in the afterlife, right? And so there is this conception that you die and then you go through whatever liminal phase exists within that religious or philosophical tradition, and then you sort of come out on the other side and you keep physically doing stuff, right? You go back to being basically alive, just in the afterlife. And so that idea of preserving her face through, probably in this case, like the carving of a sarcophagus or the painting of a funerary mask or something like this, right? And this idea in the second stanza, may she recognize herself. And Shenoda often does this formulation where it's, I don't know if you're going to be able to see this, herself, with the self, with a dash in there and an N dash in there and self italicized. Again, in part because a big component of this collection is this concern with the self and with identity, right? And this very sort of traditionally ancient Egyptian idea that death is not the dissolution of the self, it's merely a transition from one version of the self to another. So we get a lot of poems that explore these sorts of ideas, this question of like, how one preserves oneself or recognizes oneself when separated from the life that one knows, either going to the afterlife or going into exile, diaspora, whatever it is, or through the sort of trauma of colonization and the imposition of a different language or a different religion, different cultural systems, whatever it is, right? And ultimately, this collection is very interested in sort of coexistences of these various cultural forces. And we get that, for instance, in a poem like Descendant Ponders Space, which is the next one that I'm going to read to you. And it's very much about the sort of coexistence of the living and the dead next to one another. In this very, again, I would say very traditionally sort of Egyptian way. Whereas in, say, contemporary Western cultures, we tend to have distinct cemeteries or whatever it is, places where the dead are put so that they are not around the living. But so this is Descendant Ponders Space. Of Cairo's millions, a multitude live in the cemeteries, in sepulchres with the quietest of neighbors. There is more space for them there with the dead than in the victorious city with the living. 2 or 3 times a year we go to visit my grandparents, and the occupants make us shy, assure us that all is well, that they are taking care of things, and that our dead are at peace. And every 50 years the bodies of the dead will be consolidated to make space for the bodies of the living. So, I mean, in this case, even though it is cemeteries, sepulchres, things like this, there's also an element of sort of interconnectedness to the experience of the living and the dead, right? And there's a sense of presence in a way that you often don't have in cultures like contemporary Western cultures, where we have much less sort of concern with the physical remains of the dead. And I think that's true as well of contemporary Egyptian culture, as opposed to, say, ancient Egyptian culture, where concern about the nature and status of the remains of the dead was quite important. But we also, again, have these sort of larger forces within the poetry collection that Shenoda's work is concerned with. Things about, again, colonialism and the trade in antiquities, the physical consumption of mummies, but also even modern practices like museum preservation techniques and the display of mummified remains and things like this. And all of these things are, and like the British Museum is the real famous example of this, right? The British Museum consistently criticized online for taking artifacts from throughout the former British Empire and being very, very reluctant to return them. But that's true of a lot of museums all over the world, right? In my hometown museum, the Memorial Art Gallery, which I love, I think it's an amazing museum, they have a mummified person on display as part of the Egyptian exhibit. Is it ethical to do so? That's a fraught question, and a lot of it depends on who you ask, what ethical standards you're applying, and which value systems are guiding your judgment. And I don't have a hard and fast answer for this, but within the ethical world of Shenoda's poetry, there are clearly these problematic elements to the ongoing taking of and display of mummified human remains. And before I read you this poem, I'll mention this. She uses this term repeatedly. Encyclopedic museum in brackets. Encyclopedic in brackets. I assume that that's supposed to be a reference to the British Museum. But that shows up in a couple of different poems. So anyway, this is Descendant Names Modern Mummy Eaters. We are much more progressive now. We politely unraveled displaced mummies in sanitized basements of encyclopedic museums, untuck their amulets and number them. During the 1926 to 1927 excavation season, 299 scarabs, 65 in Museum, Cairo, the rest acquired by the Encyclopedic Museum in the Division of Finds. We gobble them with our eyes beside CT scans of their insides in a civilized cybernetic unwrapping. These spoils of innumerable wars, now under lock and alarm, where none witness, save those with a passport, the extent of thievery in this courteous cabinet of encyclopedic curiosities. Sorry. So again, I think it's a really, really cool poetry collection. And it's exploring these very interesting, challenging issues, again, of identity, of history, colonialism, connections with the past, etc., etc. And it does it in this very, very striking and engaging way.